So today, I wanted to talk about our trauma responses. I know with myself, when I was on my Cptsd recovery journey in the very beginning, I had no idea what my trauma responses were. Like if you asked me, well, what is your go-to trauma response? I would have been like, huh? And not only was I unaware or unconscious of what my trauma response was, I also didn't realize that I could balance them. I didn't have to be reacting from them. I didn't have to have them having more power over my life than my conscious mind. And here's the thing. Once we can start understanding what our trauma response is, like that's the first step. We can't change anything until it's in our conscious awareness. As we're doing that, we could also build our capacity to be with what comes up in the body when we go into those trauma responses, which we don't tend to notice because the charge tends to come up in our body and we do something. We go into our trauma response. We go into our coping skills. We don't even notice the charge. And so until we can peel it back to the charge, to be able to build our capacity to be with that charge and then start helping the body. It's not even that we have to help the body. It's more like we have to get out of our own way so the body can then process that unmetabolized charge that's in the body so that our nervous system feels regulated. And then we can feel like us instead of our trauma responses or our coping skills. I hope that made sense. Okay. Bottom line is today, what I wanted to talk about was the freeze response. Especially if you've been through childhood trauma, if you had narcissistic parents, if you had parents that were emotionally unavailable, or maybe you didn't have abusive parents, but maybe they worked a lot. And so you had to deal with highly charged emotional things by yourself. And so you never got the emotional support you needed to handle strong emotions. And so they get stuck as well. Regardless, I want to talk about the freeze response because in childhood, that's normally the one we wind up going to. Because if there's danger in childhood, we can't fight. We're defenseless. We're helpless. We are dependent on our caregivers. So we can't fight. So that trauma response gets put to the side. Or maybe when we get to those toddler years where we start to be a little bit defiant and we start to try to find out where our boundaries are, if when doing that, we were met with extreme shame or extreme emotional punishment, right? Where mom was happy with me when I was happy and quiet, but mom withdrew her love when I was upset or angry. So there's like an emotional punishment without understanding and without getting the help needed to work through the strong emotion. Well, then we stop fighting. We start thinking that that fight response is bad. Using that word bad, I just want to mention that none of our trauma responses are bad. They are all needed and all necessary. It's getting stuck in one of them that becomes the problem. Okay, but we start getting that story that if I stand up for myself, I'm bad. We also can't flee, right? The flight response winds up getting thwarted because it's not like we can pack our bags and go no contact when we're 3 years old with toxic family members, right? So we can't fight, we can't flee. So oftentimes the go-to trauma response is freeze. And I want to talk a little bit about freeze and collapse and how they're similar and what they look like. When it comes to the freeze or collapse trauma responses, they look or they have the appearance of not being able to move. You're frozen. In fact, in a somatic experiencing session, when I'm working with my clients or in training, when I'm having a practitioner work with me and we're working with the nervous system, right? At times I'll go into that freeze response and I'm sitting in this chair and it's like, I can't lift my arms. They're that heavy. You feel that frozen. So what that looks like is, let's say you're in a relationship. How it might come up is you're having a discussion, but your partner winds up getting upset or angry. And I'm not talking about an abusive partner. I'm talking about just a healthy relationship, because getting angry and upset is normal. It's a human experience. There's nothing wrong with being upset. What you do when you're upset can cause a problem, but there's nothing wrong with being upset. So let's say you notice your partner upset If you had trauma in childhood where people were angry a lot, then that caused you to feel unsafe. Their anger caused an overcoupling in your nervous system where anger and unsafe went together. And if you were in that for a long period of time, our body can view anger and anyone upset as a perceived threat. That person isn't really a threat. That person is your partner. They love you, but they are upset. But to the nervous system, that means danger. And so if your trauma response is to freeze, you might find yourself shutting down. You stop talking, you stop engaging, you feel disconnected. And the same thing can happen if you go into collapse as well. From the outside, they can look a little bit similar, but what's going on the inside is what really differentiates them. I'll describe them both, and then you can start bringing more awareness into your life. If you tend to freeze, if you tend to shut down, you'll start to be able to understand what's going on inside your body. So with freeze, you are hyper aroused. There's activation underneath the frozen exterior. Whereas with shutdown or collapse, you are hypo aroused. There's disactivation. Your body's slowing down. And so how that feels in your body. In the freeze, your muscles are really tense and they're full of energy, but you're not doing anything. You may not even realize it until you start bringing your awareness into your body and you realize how clenched your fists are, your upper arms, your legs. In shutdown, your muscles are really loose. It's almost like you have no muscles. There is zero tension. There's zero life in your body. In freeze, there's both sympathetic and parasympathetic activation. In other words, your nervous system is turning on and off at the same time, very much like a car with one foot slammed on the gas pedal and one foot slammed on the brake. Imagine you can see that the wheels are spinning in that car. You can sense the amount of energy that's there, but it's not moving. That's what's happening in your body in the freeze response. Whereas in the shutdown, it's just your parasympathetic nervous system is what is dominating. As a result, there is a decrease in your heart rate, your blood pressure goes down, your temperature goes down, which is the opposite in the freeze, where there's an increase in your heart rate and your blood pressure. In freeze, you might be able to say, I'm stuck. I can't move, which I've said in a somatic experiencing session, and I've had my clients say them as well. Or I feel like there's this huge weight on me and I just can't move. Whereas in shutdown or collapse, you may not even be able to speak. You might just have a blank stare. And something else that's interesting when you're in the collapse state is that sensory information stops at the thalamus. And so it's never integrated. It never gets to your cortex, the thinking areas of your brain. And so you feel really disconnected from your external and or your internal world. And so sometimes in a somatic experiencing session, how you'll notice this, you almost can't find yourself in space. So if your eyes are closed, and in fact, in Thriver School of Transformation, we had somebody say this recently. We were doing an exercise and she's like, Michelle, when I had my eyes closed, it's like I had to open them to find my hand. Logically, I knew my hand was there, but I couldn't find it with my eyes closed. So when you're when you're working on your nervous system and your body goes into that collapse state, that ability to find yourself and feel connected to yourself and know where you are, have that spatial awareness gets affected. So those are some of the differences for anyone that's wondering, well, how does freeze differentiate from collapse? Another way that it might show up in your life is that you might really want to do something and you might even feel the activation to want to do it. It might be something that you want to create, something exciting that you want to do. But if in your life you were punished for doing the things that you enjoyed and doing the things that you love, you might feel your body go kicking on to want to do it and shutting down immediately, almost like there's a wall in front of you. I'm going, and you're always slamming into something. That's another example of the freeze response and how it shows up in your life. As you're learning to balance your trauma responses so that They don't control you or your life anymore. Something that's important to understand is that as you're working through freeze, we think freeze while the person's still. So when they come out of freeze, like everything will be like calm and comfortable. Well, it will get there. It will get calm and comfortable. However, underneath freeze is a tremendous amount of energy, fight or flight energy. And so in order to come out and get to that place of calm, we need to build our capacity to work through all of that fight or flight energy that's going to come up. And that's where somatic experiencing sessions are so helpful, because if we try to do it alone, it can be overwhelming. A lot can come up if we don't know how to help our nervous system to regulate itself. Then we can find ourselves very dysregulated, and we can find ourselves really re-traumatized. So just keep that in mind as you're working with your nervous system to make sure that you have the support needed. So you think about how much energy is needed to keep your body tense and braced, right? There's so much energy. There's so much fight or flight energy going on inside of your body. So you're exhausted. You're exhausted, and every little thing can feel overwhelming. I remember when I first got out of a very traumatic situation where I was living in trauma for a really long time. So I wound up in functional freeze, right? I had to continue life. I had to do things, but I was also in this freeze trauma response. After that situation had ended and I was still in the functional freeze trauma response, I can remember standing in my kitchen, and there were maybe 3 plates that I had to wash and feeling so overwhelmed. Sometimes in my life now, I'll be being productive and I'll remember those times and I'll be like, wow, I remember, look at what I'm doing. I remembered when doing this felt impossible. And at the time when it felt impossible, I remember thinking there was something wrong with me. There's something wrong with me. I'm unmotivated. I can't be motivated. I'm lazy. I remember thinking all I ever do is procrastinate. And I said those things and I looked at myself with judgment. So I was getting mad at myself. I was trying to take myself by the back of the collar, fling myself forward and shove myself without realizing that the whole reason that I couldn't do those things wasn't because I was lazy, wasn't because I was unmotivated, and it wasn't because I wanted to procrastinate or self-sabotage. It was because my body didn't feel safe still. I didn't have the capacity to do those things. And so I wish I could put out a video and be like, do da, 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 and tomorrow you are out of functional freeze. But it doesn't work that way. When we've been stuck in a trauma response for a long time, it takes time. We have to learn how to show up with ourselves or to ourselves, with ourselves differently. We have to stop trying to shove ourselves the way someone else probably shoved us, right? And tried to force us to be a certain way. We have to stop doing that with ourselves. And we have to reestablish a relationship between our mind and our body. And that takes time. And that's exactly what I try to help people to do in Thriver School of Transformation. In fact, next month, starting in July, the theme of the month is how to overcome fawning. We're going to dedicate that month to the trauma response of fawning. Make sure you check out our live meetings in Thriver School of Transformation.